It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us today is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Notre Dame, Dr. Daniel Philpott. Thanks for being back on the show, Dr. Philpott.
Great to be with you, Kyle.
You have dedicated, if not your entire life, at least a good chunk of it to researching and sharing the story and, I believe, reducing the impact of religious persecution, and including like the most extreme versions of deadly manifestations of it. We've talked with you in episodes 100, 151, 165, and 387 about it. Unfortunately, it keeps seeming to come up with issues like refugees and immigration. But you made a very powerful connection to religious persecution, the sufferings of Christ, and the sex abuse scandals in a recent article. What inspired that?
Well, one of the things I've been really interested in is how the Christian church has been involved in political orders where Christians have suffered injustices, but also larger societies have. Maybe that's in the context of genocide, dictatorship, and so forth. And how they've tried to bring a kind of distinctively Christian response rooted in Christ's resurrection and death and Eucharist to these kinds of political, deep, harrowing political problems. And so as I watched this latest round of the sex abuse scandals emerge, I got to thinking, well, I wonder if some of the lessons of how the church has forged a very winsome response to those kinds of terrible evils might be brought to bear, on what we're facing, which is also a very wide-ranging, enormity of injustices.
And what would be some of the overlaps maybe, and maybe some contrast between the two situations?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I see the church doing in political orders is responding to contexts where the main responses seem to be secular ones, led by the UN, the human rights community, and so forth. And those all have very good commitments and principles. But the church is saying, wait a second, we're the church, and we think that we have a message of healing and reconciliation rooted in our founding events, Christ's death and resurrection, that could give a different kind of response. And that's what I see here. So much of the response has to do with legal measures, with maybe the role of journalists exposing injustices, therapists, and so forth. And all of those are very important, and I'm very grateful for them, but they really follow kind of secular logics. Well, what would it mean if the church were to bring a kind of deeply Christian response as the body of Christ, rooted in Eucharist, to bringing restoration to this problem? That's what I'm inspired to ask.
Is it a both-and situation?
Sure. I mean, I think, for instance, I think journalists have done us a great service in kind of exposing a lot of these abuses and forcing the church to deal with them. And yet, here's a good example. It's important that we know the truth. But if you look at the way in which Christ vindicated the truth on the cross, it wasn't simply revealing injustices, but it was bringing a healing logic to injustices. Healing, forgiveness, the defeat of sin. And that seems to me to imply that when we reveal the truth about things, we ought to do so in a way that seeks to bring healing to victims and bring restoration. And I think that's something we could do a lot more of. How to bring about the kind of truth about these injustices in a way that brings restoration to people rather than just kind of brings out knowledge.
And it seems to go back to like the truth and love, the journalistic investigation, but also a compassion element to it. So can you maybe open that up a little bit, and what does that actually look like? How do we put that into effect?
Yeah, well, that's where we need to think creatively. And one thing I think we can do is to bring the logic of cross and resurrection to the healing of victims. One of the features of the cross is that Christ hides people in his wounds. He incorporates humanity himself, hides them in his wounds. Could victims find a kind of source for healing in being hid in the wound and joined to the wounds of Christ? This might entail them coming to look at their memories of these kind of abuses which have shattered their lives in a kind of, through Christ who wants to take those memories and transform them into people who are loved and restored and experience solidarity with him. And how to do that? Well, maybe this could be done in kind of parish forums and settings where they are listened to, and maybe a group setting led by qualified lay Catholics or priests who are experts in these things. I don't know exactly, but I would like, what if we could look at healing not just through the kind of secular categories, but through redemptive categories?
We're talking with Dr. Daniel Philpott, and he wrote an article over at irisrover.net. It's called "Where is Jesus in the Sex Abuse Scandals?" Talking about that a little bit here. And one of the things you're talking about, that shift from just truth and journalistic investigations to the compassion part of it, like kind of a both and that we said. One of the things that you said was practices like punishment and penance shift the focus from victim to perpetrator. So is there an appropriate balance between focusing on victims, on perpetrators, and focusing on solutions? It seems like the three different routes that people might get pulled into.
Well, yeah, I think that the same kind of, redemptive, restorative logic, I think could be brought to the perpetrators. And I think absolutely essential is accountability and reform of institutions. I'm in no way advocating a kind of being soft on the perpetrators. We've discovered that there was all too much of a tendency to shift them around or to get therapy for them, and that has proved vastly inadequate. So yes, there have to be very strong measures about removing abusive priests from the situations where they're going to be doing this again, and so forth. But we've also seen the leaders of the church, the cardinals and the bishops, issue apologies and reparations as mandated by courts of law and so forth. But I think, again, looking at this in terms of deeply Christian practices, I would propose the practice of penance. And this has been developed by author Mike Griffin, a friend of mine here in South Bend at Holy Cross College, who wrote a book about practices of penance with respect to injustices. So what if, bishops would say not only we are regretful of what was done and so forth, but to issue a kind of deeper penance that might include, as we're seeing with recent revelations, some of the ways in which maybe they were complicit, in the cases where they were. But a kind of penance that involves a sort of deeply Christian expression of contrition, of a kind of empathy with victims and their sufferings, a kind of desire for healing, as opposed to a kind of legalistic thing where it looks like the church is just sort of doing what the court mandated.
Right. So how do we as laity participate in this, and what can we do?
Well, I think one thing is we can not only call for accountability, and I think that that's critical, and reform, but also I think maybe encourage ways to foster healing for victims and foster a kind of more deeply Christian practices of recognizing their suffering. I mean, one of the things I see in the political realm in truth and reconciliation commissions, they try not just to expose the truth, but to enact a deep acknowledgement of what victims have gone through, a kind of empathy. And again, exactly how this might be done needs to be explored. Maybe this could be done through parish circles in which victims are recognized by other parishioners. It would have to be in a confidential setting and so forth. But where there's much more a kind of expression of empathy for those whose lives have been shattered.
And one of the most difficult things that you suggest in your article is the idea of forgiveness. So who needs to be forgiven, and then how and when should that happen?
Yeah, and that's kind of the final mile that I propose is, forgiveness is really the essence of what Jesus is doing on the cross and the way that he asks us to participate in what he does on the cross. And again, what I see in political settings remarkably is people who are victims of crimes and injustices and human rights violations, actually practicing forgiveness, forgiving their perpetrators, but doing so in a way that brought healing to themselves as well as healing to the situation. And, people might wince a little bit if, I would propose forgiveness. And I want to emphasize, I certainly don't mean it for in any way be a substitute for accountability or a kind of condoning of the wrongs. Right. But I want to say that it can actually be something through which victims are strengthened and find healing, particularly if they see it as done through Christ, that they're not doing it alone, but they're incorporated into Jesus' healing, Jesus' forgiveness of perpetrators from the cross. And they're empowered to do that through Jesus and through the way that he set forth, but even through being joined to him on the cross, they could experience the kind of healing and restoration that comes from forgiveness.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's also something that I think has been almost utterly ignored and hardly talked about at all in the last 20 years or so of this abuse crisis. And yet, read the Gospel of Matthew. I think it's absolutely essential and central to what Jesus is calling us to.
And you actually share some stories, too, of those that have had religious persecution and their experience with forgiving, like you were kind of mentioning here. Any of those kind of come to mind?
Yeah, certainly in different parts of the world. Like there was Shahbaz Bhatti in Pakistan, who was Minister of Minorities Affairs and who sensed that he was going to be killed for his witness for religious minorities in Pakistan and kind of, forgave his perpetrators in advance, perceiving that he was going to be killed. And then after he was killed, his family forgave the perpetrators. And it was a kind of witness that really inspired kind of a deep sympathy and devotion, even on the part of the surrounding Muslim population. So a similar dynamic happened in Algeria, where the monks of Trappist monks in 1996 were killed by Islamic militants, and anticipating this, they wrote a letter expressing forgiveness, and also, just earned kind of devotion. Thousands of Muslims showed up at their funeral because they were inspired by their kind of moral example. Even here in the U.S., we've had cases like the Amish of Nickel Mines in 2006. A shooter went in and killed members of their daughters who were in a schoolroom. And that night they were forgiving and comforting his wife. He had shot himself in the killing, but showing empathy for members of his family. There was also the members of the African American church in Charleston. We remember the shooting there a few years back, but who also forgave the perpetrator, Dylan Reed. And they were doing so out of a deep commitment and understanding of what the scriptures were calling for.
And you go into more details, more examples and statistics and things like that, so people should check out the article. It's available at irisrover.net. And where can people find more information about you, or what other projects do you have going on?
Well, I'm on the web in the Department of Political Science, University of Notre Dame, and there's a little description in bio and then links to various projects and writings and so forth.
All right, and I'll have links to those too in our show notes, but also check out the good work that you're doing with Under Caesar's Sword. I highly recommend people check that out as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Daniel Philpott, for joining us today and really challenging us too. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kyle. Wonderful to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity.